Welcome. I'm Teresa Reed, a member of the Brews and Views Committee of the Ann Arbor Area League of Women Voters. This is our second of 3 monthly Brews and Views on the topic of voting systems. Last month, we talked with Professor J. Alex Halderman about election security, facts, myths, and fixes. And this month, we're lucky to have as our guest Jonathan Brater, Michigan's Director of Elections. In November 2018, Michigan voters overwhelmingly approved Proposition 3, which was formally titled the Voting Policies in State Constitution Initiative, which made sweeping changes in Michigan's election laws. These changes included instituting same-day voter registration, allowing no excuse absentee voting, providing the option to vote straight party ticket, automatic voter registration, and more. The 2020 presidential election was the first election in which these new laws were in effect. How well did they work for Michigan voters? How well did state and local authorities implement these new laws? What improvements in implementation or obstacles to implementation can we expect in 2022? And how can community members facilitate success? These are the questions we have for Jonathan Brater, who, as the Director of Elections for the state of Michigan, oversees implementation of Prop 3 and all other aspects of Michigan election law. Before joining the Secretary of State's office, Mr. Brater served as counsel for the Brennan Center's Democracy Program, where his work focused on voting rights and elections. In this capacity, Mr. Brater worked on litigation to block enforcement of restrictive voting laws and policies in state and federal court. An expert on voter registration law and policy, Mr. Brater has drafted legislation and published analysis on automatic voter registration and has testified before state and national bodies, including the Presidential Commission on Election Administration. Mr. Brater, welcome to Brews and Views. We're so happy to have you.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm really delighted to be speaking with all of you this evening about the many ways in which Proposal 2018-3 supported voting rights and in many ways enabled us to have a successful election in 2020. Just briefly, by way of background, I'm happy to be speaking with you all. I grew up in Ann Arbor and I went to Michigan Law School, so it's sort of very familiar with the area and the league's work. I also did work with the league quite a bit in my prior job before coming to the Michigan Department of State when I was at the Brennan Center. So I started in 2019 working at the Secretary of State's office. I was working in a different capacity as legal policy director. And then our then director of elections, Sally Williams, retired at the end of 2019. So I then assumed the role of director of elections after being appointed by Secretary Benson at the beginning of 2020. So that was my first year on the job. It was certainly an interesting first year. But having spoken to a lot of other experienced election workers and clerks and election directors from other states, there was nothing that necessarily would have prepared anyone for that year anyway, so it may have been just as well. So I'm going to talk about the ways in which Proposal 2018-3 supported voting rights and also had a lot of benefits as well as some challenges for election administration in 2020, and also about the ways in which it did anticipate a lot of the issues that became relevant across the country in the 2020 election, both with regard to conducting election under a pandemic and also conducting and defending an election in the midst of a lot of false information, disinformation, and attempts to undermine the outcome of the election. So I'm primarily going to talk about the changes to voter registration, the changes to absentee voting, and the expanded post-election audits that were required and enabled by Proposal 2018-3. So I'm going to now start sharing my screen. Hopefully this will work. Proposal 2018-3, as many of you probably know, it was an amendment to the Michigan State Constitution. It was passed after being put on the ballot by a initiative petition it gained enough signatures from voters that it was placed directly on the ballot in 2018 and passed with pretty overwhelming majority in the 2018 election. And it amended Article 2, Section 4 of the Michigan Constitution in many different ways, which I'm going to talk about in a second. The first thing to really understand about the impact of Proposal 2018-3 on our elections is just a sort of a quick overview of how we do elections in Michigan. Again, many of you probably know this, but Michigan is pretty unique in having very decentralized elections. Unlike most states that have a county-based election system, Michigan's election system is administered primarily by city and township clerks. We have 1,520 of those across the state. So we are the largest in terms of number of in terms of population to have a decentralized system like this. Wisconsin has about 2,000 local clerks, but they're not as big as us population-wise. Most of the states that are like Michigan and Wisconsin and have locally run elections are in the Northeast and are much smaller. So we have a very decentralized system, and our local clerks are the ones who really run our elections. That said, an additional layer of complexity is that county clerks do actually have several very important election responsibilities. That includes printing ballots, programming election equipment, conducting post-election audits, and a lot of other functions. So we do have a combination of overlapping county and municipal responsibilities. And then the Secretary of State and the Bureau of Elections oversee and administer elections statewide. So the Secretary of State is the chief election official. The Bureau of Elections works on the Secretary's behalf in fulfilling that function. The most important thing that we do is we maintain the state qualified voter file, which is our statewide voter registration database, but it's also the backbone of a lot of different election functions that our clerks use and voters use, including the online voter registration system, processing absentee ballots, and doing a lot of other election related functions. So, we had, unlike some other states that have had some of the policies that were in Proposal 2018-3 for a while, we have a very decentralized system. So we had to implement all of these new rules on a very broad, diverse set of jurisdictions. So here's a quick overview of the things that were in Proposal 2018-3. I'm not going to talk about all of these in depth, but it did put in the Constitution the right to the secret ballot. It required under the Constitution that military and overseas voters who've requested ballots by the 45th day before the election get those ballots sent to them. That was already in state law as a statute, but this puts it in our state constitution. And this, along with the state Michigan election law requirement that all absentee voters get their ballots by the 40th day before the election if they requested them, did really combine with absentee voting, no reason absentee voting, to change the way people voted in 2020. It added automatic voter registration, which I'll talk about next, or very soon anyway. It added voter registration up to and including election day. So it got rid of the old 30-day registration deadline. It replaced it with a registration deadline of 15 days for all methods other than at the clerk's office. And it also allowed people to register up to and on election day at their local, that is city or township clerk's office. It also created no reason absentee voting, which of course had a huge impact on the 2020 election. It restored straight party voting, which I'm not going to talk about too much today, but it did do that. And then it also gave all voters in Michigan the right to have results of statewide elections audited. We already did audits in Michigan prior to Proposal 2018-3, but this made it a constitutional right. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is voter registration. In some ways, the biggest impact that the changes to voter registration had on the 2020 election in Michigan were things that we didn't see. There certainly were problems related to voter registration in the 2020 election. It didn't completely eliminate these, as I'll talk about a bit later. But in Michigan, as well as a lot of other states that had limited or more restrictive voter registration rules, voter registration has historically been one of the biggest barriers to participation. It's been wielded in some cases in the past intentionally to discriminate against classes of voters. But even when it's not necessarily explicitly being used for that purpose, the effects of registration laws that require you to register in advance of elections, that limit the ways in which you can register or the ways you can update your registration, tend to disproportionately affect younger voters, in some cases, older voters, voters of color, students, low-income voters. They tend to be more disproportionately affected by ways that limit the methods of voter registration. And in Michigan in past years, as in a lot of other states that had more strict registration deadlines, one of the primary reasons that people could not vote, or one of the primary challenges that election administrators had, were voter registration related problems. So someone missing the 30-day registration deadline and not being able to vote, or someone showing up at the polls thinking they were registered and either not being able to vote or possibly being able to vote if they were qualified using a provisional ballot, which was sometimes effective, but a difficult process to administer, and is certainly a thorn in the side of election administrators because of the difficulty of processing those. So by getting rid of the 30-day close of registration, moving it to 15 days, and also allowing a same-day registration option, Proposal 2018-3 really eliminated those biggest barriers. The other thing it did was, by creating automatic voter registration, it allowed a lot more voters to get registered in a streamlined way in advance of Election Day, and also update their registration in advance of Election Day in a way that benefited voters, to allow them to get more information about their voter status, to not have to worry about registration at the last minute, and also helping clerks by having people's registration status more up to date. So automatic voter registration, what this is essentially is changing registration from an opt-in to an opt-out. So if you have a qualifying transaction at a relevant state agency, what automatic voter registration means is, instead of having to separately answer yes to the question, do you want to register to vote, or instead of having to fill out a separate voter registration form, automatic voter registration takes all that information that you've already provided, that already demonstrates that you're eligible to vote, and we just go ahead and use that and register you unless you affirmatively opt out. So that's the biggest change. Now in Michigan, I will say, Michigan already had a pretty good system of registration at the Secretary of State's office, or motor voter. Michigan's had Secretary of State or DMV-based voter registration for a long time. It was actually one of the models for the National Voter Registration Act, which brought motor voters statewide or nationwide in the mid-90s. So Michigan's actually already done a pretty good job of registering people when they have transactions at the branch, but automatic voter registration actually did bump this up quite a bit. So we first implemented automatic voter registration in branches in September 2019. And the process of doing that was essentially changing our intake procedures, changing the form you fill out when you apply for a driver's license or state ID to make it an opt-out, putting in place to make sure procedures to make sure that we were only registering eligible citizens. By the time we were able to implement it, we had about 9 months go by, but we did figure out a way to register other voters previously, which I'll talk about in a second. But what we saw when we put it into place is, despite the fact that Michigan already had a pretty robust DMV or motor voter based registration system, switching it to opt out did actually significantly increase the rate of new registrations that we're seeing at the branches. In the first couple of months of implementation, we were seeing about a 15% increase in the rate of people who got registered at branches. Now, that doesn't mean the registration rate in Michigan increased 15%, but it does mean that, instead of registering about 4,000 people per week at the branches, we were registering about 4,600. So we were seeing a significantly higher percentage of people who completed a branch transaction get registered to vote when they did that. So that was an immediate effect. We didn't really get to measure this over a long period of time, because starting in March, obviously March 2020, our branch transactions changed significantly, just like everything else in our society. So we weren't really able to do a longer view of the impacts of that. But as people are coming back to the branches, I think we're going to continue to see high rates of registration through our branches. We were also able to utilize transactions through the mail and online for driver's licenses, including using a mailer to send back to people who had had a transaction at an SOS branch, Secretary of State branch, before we implemented it, but after it was already required by the state constitution, which took effect in December of 2018, even though we weren't able to implement it until September of the next year. And so between those mail and online options, as well as the in-person automatic voter registration, I would estimate that we had about 300,000 voters added to the voter rolls as a result of automatic voter registration. It's a little hard to really say definitively what was attributable only to automatic voter registration, because you don't know for sure if some of those folks may have ended up registering a different way. But that's, if you just look at kind of the historical rate of registration through the SOS branches in past years compared to post AVR, I would estimate that it was around 300,000 that additional people got registered this way. And we did see our number of voters who are registered statewide increase from about 7.5 million to 8 million by the November election. Again, that's not all attributable to automatic voter registration. It's also not necessarily all attributable to anything in Proposal 2018-3. There were lots of other factors like mobilization efforts by both nonpartisan and partisan groups, the fact that Michigan was a swing state. There were definitely a lot of things that went into it, but certainly I think automatic voter registration was one of the biggest reasons that we saw our registration rate go up so much. The other benefit that we saw just in terms of more people getting registered to vote is it did lead to more frequent address updates that were spread out more over the course of the year. We did already take driver's license address updates and use those to update people's voter registrations, but automatic voter registration, by making sure people got registered with every transaction, even if it was a change of address, did lead to more people getting registered when they updated their driver's license, instead of, for example, an unregistered person updating their driver's license, not getting registered, and then having to register at the last second. So we got more people registered at their current address at the time they had that driver's transaction. That was good for the voters. It also helps clerks because it means you have fewer people coming in at the last second to update their registration. The other big change was the change to the deadlines for voter registration. So again, previously Michigan had 30-day registration, 30 days in advance of election day registration deadline. That was one of the farthest out in the country. So Proposal 2018-3 moved that up to 15 days for any method other than in person with your clerk. So that would include automatic voter registration. It would include online voter registration, which was also implemented, not because of Proposal 2018-3, but also actually because of a bill the legislature passed the same year, and registration by mail, and also registration by voter registration drives, which I know the league is very familiar with. Any of those methods of registration, you have to do it by the 15th day before the election to get registered. We did see quite a few registrations that came in between day 15 and day 30 before every election in 2020. So this changed from 30 days to 15 days for every method of voter registration. I think that itself actually helped a lot more people get registered in advance of election day before you even consider same-day registration. But then the other thing that Proposal 2018-3 did was it made sure that there is a backstop for anybody who misses that 15-day deadline to register in person with a clerk. When you do register in person with a clerk, there are some additional requirements under the Constitution. You do have to provide proof of residency when you register. It's a fairly flexible list of documents. So, you can use a driver's license if you have that, but you can also use a utility bill, a bank statement, government check. And, we found that it's generally agreed that a lot of documents meet these requirements. So for example, student IDs are allowed, student documents that show your address on campus are allowed. So there were quite a few different documents that can be shown, but depending on the type of document that is shown, that does result in a different kind of ballot getting issued. There was actually a lot of litigation on this. I think the league was involved in some of that. So this is kind of an ongoing issue, but there is a method of registration up to election day for voters. So the fact that people were able to register up through election day, I think again, the impacts of that were somewhat limited by the pandemic, but going into our elections leading up to March, we did see immediate impacts there. So for the March 10th, 2020 primary, we saw more than 10,000 people use voter registration on election day. So that's 10,000 people that most likely would not have been able, or more than 10,000 people that most likely would not have been able to vote if it hadn't been for same-day registration. We have tried to encourage people to register in advance if they can and think of same-day registration as a backstop. But we all know that people don't always do that, and so it is really important to have that as an option. In March 2020, we saw a big disproportionate use of same-day registration in college towns. So, for example, Ann Arbor had over 1,000 people register on election day on March 10th, city of Ann Arbor. Obviously, that's about a 10th of the statewide same-day registrants, and that's a lot more than Ann Arbor's share of the statewide population. There's also a lot of same-day registration usage in East Lansing, in Kalamazoo, in Grand Rapids, in Dearborn, a lot of places where we have large student populations. We did see a lot of same-day registration. And that did lead to some pretty long lines. I'm sure some of the folks on this call recall that there were some long lines outside of City Hall in Ann Arbor. I think that that the clerks were prepared for same-day registration, but we all probably underestimated the amount of time that these same-day registration transactions would take and the number of people that would try to take advantage of it. So that did lead to some pretty long lines in college towns, but it was definitely utilized and it did allow a lot of people to be able to vote. The other thing that it did, even though it did create some implementation challenges at the clerk's offices, is it did reduce the provisional ballot problems at the polling place, because now instead, if someone shows up at the polling place and isn't on the list, instead of having to work through the provisional ballot process and have that person fill out a ballot that may or may not end up getting counted, you can direct them to the clerk's office and they can register and they can fill out an absentee ballot there. So that makes a really big difference. We did see this as actually one of the biggest potential challenges for the November election based on what had happened in March. So we had our eye on this really since the beginning of implementation of Proposal 2018-3. We knew that March 2020 would be a big test of it. And we did see that there was going to be a lot of demand for it. So following March 2020, there was an effort made in a lot of places to really account for the expected increase in students using this. One of those was one of those you saw in Ann Arbor when the city clerk and the university set up a satellite office at the University of Michigan Museum of Art. That was a very successful initiative. I was there a couple of times and I would always see students coming in and out. And other community members coming in and out, and other places that had a large student population and also larger cities where they could expect longer lines did prepare for this to really get ready for the surge on election day in November. That ended up not being as big of an issue just because of the fact that so many people ended up voting absentee because of the pandemic. It was actually the night of our March 10th presidential primary when the first case of COVID in Michigan was reported. And ever since then, it kind of dramatically changed the trajectory of election preparations, and same-day registration definitely continued to be a huge deal and will be in future elections, but probably wasn't the biggest impact issue for November. The biggest impact issue for November was absentee voting. So another big change that Proposal 2018-3 made was it eliminated the reasons that were required for applying for an absentee ballot. Prior to Proposal 2018-3, you had to meet one of several basically excuses or reasons that you needed to vote by mail. So maybe you had to be out of your community, you had to be over a certain age, you had to have an illness. There were a few different reasons that you might qualify, but you did need to have a reason. Proposal 2018-3 got rid of that. And it, essentially allows anybody now to vote by mail or to vote, by delivering their ballot in person early. We were really expecting this to have a huge impact on the election even before the pandemic. Typically, what you see in other states that have moved to no reason absentee voting is that more and more people start using it. And when people start voting by mail, most people like it. So we were anticipating a change in Michigan from a scenario in which, in past elections, it was 20 to 30% of people voting by mail to eventually over half of people in Michigan choosing to vote by mail. We didn't really expect it to happen this fast, and obviously the pandemic played a role there, but we were already preparing potentially for, maybe 50% vote by mail turnout in 2020, even before the pandemic. We did see I think about 37 or 38% of people voting by mail in the March presidential primary, which was already a lot higher than we had seen in past elections. And that was, again, at least before the pandemic was reported in Michigan, although of course there probably were cases before then. So we were already expecting this to make a difference. It did have a couple of immediate benefits though. One was the elimination of the must vote in person requirement. This was something that is in the election law, basically requires you to vote in person the first time if you register by mail. But because Proposal 2018-3 now makes absentee voting a constitutional right, that provision was essentially mooted out by this constitutional amendment. So that eliminated a problem that students and some others faced in terms of their ability to be able to vote by mail. The other benefit that we saw was that because more people were applying for absentee ballots, we were seeing more people enroll in the permanent absent voter application list. So that's a list that was established a few years back that basically allows you to ask to have an absentee ballot application, not ballot, but application mailed to you before every election. And we've seen that list grow quite a bit since no reason absentee voting has been introduced. The other way that no reason absentee voting affected election administration and voters, even before the pandemic, was the increase in absentee voting and the long extended period of time before election day that you can request an absentee ballot in Michigan did lead to kind of a election month or election 2 months or election season, really, as opposed to election day. We were starting to see a lot more people want their ballot and in many cases want to return their ballot far in advance of election day. So in Michigan, because of the combination of the constitutional right to vote absentee without giving a reason, and also the statutory and constitutional requirements that if you've requested an absentee ballot, you have to get it by the 40 or 45th day before the election, depending on your military and overseas status. That means that there is a huge amount of pressure on clerks to get ballots printed and tested in the hands of voters well in advance of election day. And we saw this being a challenge starting in March, and it was a challenge for every election we had in 2020. Because of other provisions of Michigan Constitution and Michigan law, ballot contents cannot be finalized until the 60th day before the election. So that we don't actually know what's going to be on the contents of all those ballots until day 60. So that means that in order to meet these requirements, the ballot contents need to be finalized. All those ballots need to be proofed very carefully. They need to then be sent to the printers that print out the ballots. The printers have to then send test ballots, which have to be tested on machines to make sure they actually work. And then all those ballots have to be printed out and distributed to all the local clerks and sorted and gotten to voters by the 40th or 45th day before the election. That 15 days is really not enough. There's really no time for any delay or any kind of correction of mistakes without risking not being able to get people their ballots in hand by day 45 or day 40. So we have seen that be a real pressure point for clerks and for us and for everyone involved in ballot production. That is a challenge that we face right now, is that the days between day 60 and day 45 or between day 60 and day 40 are in some ways almost as busy and sometimes more busy than election day itself. And so we really do need more resources available for that across the state. The other challenge is that although we've made it easier for people to apply for ballots and return their ballots, those ballots still can't be tabulated until election day. So I'm going to talk about this a little bit at the end, but we still have a system where clerks, even though they have ballots coming in for 6 weeks before the election, they can get those envelopes, they can sort those envelopes. They had some limited ability to pre-process those envelopes in some communities, but they can't actually put them in the tabulators and start counting them until election day. So, while we have the flexibility from the voter side of returning ballots by mail, we don't really have a system that works as well for the clerks to actually count those ballots in an orderly way. And so that was a challenge on election day and Wednesday and Thursday after that. Having said that, there really are a lot of huge benefits here, and we definitely saw those with the pandemic. One of the benefits was that we did see a lot more voters interacting with their clerks over an extended period of time leading up to the election. The challenge there, again, is that it makes those 2 months before the election really busy. But the benefit is that for clerks, you do see your ballots coming in a more extended period of time. One of the other things that happened was that the Secretary of State sent out absentee ballot applications across the state, and clerks sent them across the state in some places to all voters. And that was, there was definitely some disagreement with that decision. But one of the benefits of that was that a lot of people applied for their absentee ballots well before Election Day. So going into November, a lot of people had applied, going back over the summer or over the fall. And so there wasn't really a huge surge of last minute absentee ballot applications. If that hadn't happened, if applications hadn't been sent to all voters, what we likely would have seen is a huge rush of people applying for their absentee ballots at the last second, at the deadline in the 2 weeks or the week before the election. That would have created a lot of problems for our clerks who are already quite busy, and also would have put voters at risk for not getting their ballots on time. So having that extended period of time, having everyone have an application, meant that the majority of people who voted absentee had actually already applied for and returned their ballots well in advance of the election. So that was a benefit. The second major benefit, of course, was the ability for people to vote safely during the pandemic. This was the most important element of us being able to conduct elections safely during the pandemic. Elections, at least in-person elections, are not a very pandemic-friendly exercise in a lot of different ways. Many of the traditional election functions are done in person, of course. They're often done in close quarters because you have small offices or small buildings that are being used as polling places. They're not traditionally used to have a huge number of people, where you're now all of a sudden asking a large number of temporary staff or volunteers or voters to all be in the same place for an extended period of time. Elections happen, at least presidential elections happen in November, which in Michigan usually means the weather is not particularly hospitable if you want to be spending a lot of time outside. So all of this really leads to a lot of safety concerns when it comes to having to vote when you have to be crowded in close quarters with a highly contagious, highly deadly virus circulating. I think we saw this probably most drastically in Wisconsin. Wisconsin had a primary election where there basically were no accommodations that were made for people to vote by mail. And it did create a lot of, serious health concerns, safety concerns, crowding concerns. And we were able to largely avoid that in Michigan because of the fact that we already had no reason absentee voting set up. As it turned out, all across the country, I think pretty much every state, if not all states, did end up allowing everyone to vote by mail one way or another. But in a lot of states, that was a much more of a last minute adjustment that was made. And we had the benefit of been preparing for this at least since the start of 2019 because of no reason absentee voting. So we weren't necessarily as well prepared for it as a state like Oregon or Colorado, which has had vote by mail for years. And we don't have purely vote by mail. But we did have that kind of 2-year head start, or at least 1.5 year head start, to get ready for a more primarily vote by mail election because of no reason absentee. So that really helped people be able to participate, and it helped us to largely conduct our elections safely in a way that everyone was able to participate. Here is just a chart showing like the impact of no reason absentee voting and the pandemic on the election. We did have a big increase in turnout overall. We had a record turnout in Michigan. We had over 5.5 million people vote in the 2020 election in November. That was a massive increase over the previous record, which is just over 5 million. And that was in 2008. So turnout in general surged, but the real surge was the absentee voting increase. So the 2 red bars here are the turnouts, overall turnouts compared from 2016 to 2020. In 2016, it was about 4.8 million. In 2020, it was about, over 5.5 million. That's a pretty big increase. But if you look at the absentee turnout, that's where the huge difference was. In 2016, Absentee voting turnout was about 1.3 million. And in 2020, it was about 3.3 million. So we went from a situation in which, again, it was about a quarter of people voting by mail to about 2/3 of people voting by mail in the November election. So that really drastically changed the nature and the characteristics of how people voted in Michigan. And none of this would have been possible to do effectively and efficiently if we didn't already have this expectation because of the state constitution that everyone had the right to vote by mail. We certainly had a lot of other things we had to figure out. We had to get resources to clerks to handle the increased absentee voting. Clerks had to change a lot of their procedures to make sure they had the staff and the resources and the voting equipment to handle all the absentee voting. We obviously had a lot of problems with the U.S. Postal Service. So we had to do a lot of things in terms of making sure our envelopes were up to spec, having jurisdictions install drop boxes if people didn't want to mail their ballots. There were a lot of challenges that we had to really work through, and that voters and civic groups had to work through to adjust to voting by mail. But the basic core idea that everyone could vote by mail was already in place in Michigan, and that made a big difference going into the pandemic. The final thing I'm going to talk about from 2018-3 is post-election audits. This is maybe something that didn't get quite as much attention when Proposal 2018-3 was passed. But it ended up making a huge difference after the election. And it was one of our key tools in countering a lot of the misinformation and false information that was shared about the conduct of the election in 2020. So before I get into RLAs, I'm just going to talk about this a bit more. So the Secretary of State, under the Michigan election law, sets procedures for the conduct of post-election audits. We've done audits for a long time in Michigan. They're not new, but in past years, the only type of audit that we did was basically a precinct procedural audit, which we still do. They're very important. But typically, the only type of audit that we did were mostly county clerks, but in some cases, the Secretary of State Bureau of Elections would go to individual voting precincts, and they would do a really deep dive into the precinct to make sure all the pre-election work had been done properly, all the election day safeguards and procedures were in place, and all the post-election materials had been preserved properly. They also would do a hand count of one of the races in that precinct to make sure that the hand count of the ballots matched what was on the tabulators in the voting machines. Those are really important. It's something that we continued and expanded even, but they don't necessarily give you a statewide picture of what happened. They don't really constitute a review of an entire statewide race because they're only looking at selected precincts. So utilizing the Secretary of State's authority to conduct post-election audits, which is in the election law and which is required by the Constitution, one of the things that we really built up going into 2020 was what are called risk limiting audits. Risk limiting audits are basically random sampling of ballots. What we're doing when we do a risk limiting audit is we're taking a sample of ballots from across the state or across whatever the jurisdiction is where you're trying to verify the outcome of the election. And you're checking enough ballots, a high enough percentage, so that you could see if if you had seen something that was really unusual, if there had been some major problem with the way the machines counted the ballots, you would see that in the total. So if one candidate, had gotten 60% of the votes where the machines counted the ballots, and you counted, a big chunk random sample of those ballots, and you saw that actually that candidate only got 40% of those, you would say, there's something weird going on here. It's basically just random sampling, which we use in a lot of different ways, but it allows us to verify with a good level of certainty that the tabulators, the voting machines, counted ballots accurately without having to do a full statewide hand recount, which is very labor intensive and which someone would actually have to pay for. In fact, if someone wanted a hand recount of the presidential election, they would have had to pay upwards of $600,000 for that. So that's not a very effective way of just auditing things unless someone actually wants a recount. So risk limiting audits allow us to take advantage of the fact that we have paper ballots to review a random sample of those and basically verify that the way the machines count the ballots does match up with what those ballots actually say when we look at them by hand. So we actually started building these up well before 2020. The first pilots that were done were done locally in 2018 and 2019. We worked with a lot of local clerks to sort of figure out how to do this in Michigan. As the previous slide mentioned, Colorado was the first state to use these risk limiting audits, but their procedures are based on their mail-based system and their county-based system, which don't necessarily work in Michigan, where we have locally run elections and a combination of mail and in-person ballots. So basically, in all the elections leading up to the March 2020 primary, we kept kind of building up, doing bigger and bigger races, doing different kinds of races that crossed county borders, to try to kind of perfect the system as best we could in Michigan. We also had the benefit of a clerk advisory committee from several jurisdictions that participated in the audits, as well as an election security advisory commission, which had election security experts, as well as additional clerks that gave us additional advice. And that really let us work our way up to doing a statewide pilot in March 2020. So what we did in March 2020 was we basically reviewed both the Democratic and Republican presidential primary election results. This was not a very difficult thing to audit and verify because neither one of those were very close. Obviously, the Republican primary in March was not close at all. The Democratic primary wasn't particularly close either. So we're able to actually verify this statewide or attempt to verify it statewide by only selecting about 700 ballots. So even though there had been millions of people voting in that primary, we were able to, or over 1 million, we were able to basically get a good sample just looking at about 670 ballots. What we found when we did that was that just from those random samples, every candidate's percentage in the randomly sampled paper ballots matched up within 1% of what the machine said that they had gotten. So we do have a report on this. If you want to read it, it's at michigan.gov/election security. That really got us ready for November 2020. November 2020, we again built up the risk limiting audit. So we basically took what we did in March 2020 and we ramped that up significantly. We had an audit in which we looked at more than 18,000 ballots across the state that were randomly selected from more than 1,300 city and township jurisdictions. So basically out of the 1,520 city and township clerks that we have, almost 90% of them were included in this to some extent. So we used a random number generator and rolled some dice to create a random selection. And that allowed us to just randomly pull 18,000 ballots. And so each clerk who participated in this was essentially given a random ballot or random ballots to pull. They would basically say, okay, go to your precinct number 3 and pull the 245th ballot out of that. And by all the clerks doing that, we're able to amass a random sample of about 18,000 ballots. And again, when we compared those paper ballots to the outcome of the election, we found that it was within, basically within 1% of the actual result of the election. So just as Biden had won by about 3% in the tabulated total, we found the same thing when we looked at the paper ballots. So, for those who were claiming that there had been some kind of broad conspiracy to tamper with the voting equipment or that the voting machines were flipping votes or any of the various claims that were made, that was completely debunked by the fact that we had done this very large random sample of ballots and found that the numbers matched up almost exactly with what the machine said. With a sample that big, if there had been any kind of widespread difference in the way that the machines counted ballots to what was actually on the paper ballots, we would have seen that. I'll also add that we also in Antrim County, Michigan, where there continues to be misinformation spread all over the place, we actually counted every single ballot in that county just to demonstrate that the machines work there. So, a lot of misinformation was shared about Antrim County and continues to be based on the fact that their unofficial results were reported incorrectly. We actually went in and counted every paper ballot in Antrim County, and we found that, yes, like the paper ballots did match up with what the official totals were. So in that specific place, we just did that extra, check, which is not really practical to do statewide, but we did it there because we wanted to just demonstrate. So the other two types of audits that we did, I mentioned the precinct procedural audits. I'll just touch on those briefly because they are really important. We did across the state, and when I say we, I really mean the election community because they're mostly done by county clerks, look in 200 or more than 200 different places to do a deep dive and verify that all of the proper procedures were followed by all the local clerks in those jurisdictions. All of those were completed. They were completed by county clerks of both political parties, and they did not, identify any kind of intentional misconduct by clerks at all. The audits always find mistakes and errors, which is typical, but there was nothing in there that suggested there was any kind of intentional misconduct or fraud or anything of that nature. The other thing that we did this year for the first time was we took a very close look at absent voter counting boards. Absent voter counting boards are special super precincts that are established that count all the absentee ballots for that community. Most jurisdictions use them. Pretty much all large cities and townships use them. And so one of the things that we found this year in absent voter counting boards is because there were so many absentee ballots coming in, it was challenging to count all those ballots in a short amount of time, and also make all those, and also ensure that all your record keeping was completely perfect. So in other words, making sure that all the names you had on the absentee voter list completely matched the number of ballots that were counted. Obviously, what happened in Detroit at their absent voter counting board in the TCF Center got a lot of attention. It was again used by many to spread a lot of false information about what was going on. There were a lot of people who were there who didn't really understand what they were looking at and just assumed everything they saw that they didn't understand was fraudulent. What we found actually when we looked at Detroit and the other absent voter counting boards is that all these cities actually did an excellent job of the core function of making sure all these ballots got counted. We were able to, after spending some time with the clerks and looking at the ballots and the envelopes ourselves, we were able to actually reconcile almost all of the record keeping issues that couldn't be fixed on election night or during the canvass. And we found that the total net difference between the ballots counted and the names on the EV list in these 4 big cities, which collectively counted more than 200,000 ballots, the total difference was about 20. There were about 20 more names in the poll books than absent voter ballots that were counted. And that's usually explained by things like envelopes that are missing ballots that get counted as a voter, but they don't actually have a ballot that go along with them. So we were basically able to clear all that up. If anyone wants to read our report on this, this is also at the Michigan Secretary of State's website. I think you can find it if you go to the press releases, but I'd be happy to share a link to it if anyone's having trouble finding it. It's a pretty extensive report that goes over the statewide risk limiting audit, the absent voter counting board audits, and the precinct procedural audits. Circling back to proposal 2018-3, this extensive auditing that we did, which was required by the state constitution, really provided strong, solid evidence to anyone who's actually interested in the facts, so that they could easily evaluate a lot of the false claims that were made about the election, whether related to voting machines or alleged misconduct by election officials or anything else. We were able to really debunk that. Although it didn't necessarily get a lot of attention when proposal 2018-3 was initially passed, it did end up being a very valuable tool in our arsenal to defend the integrity of the election, essentially. It also does allow us to identify when errors are made so that we can improve our training procedures and identify needed changes in legislation and elsewhere going forward. So I'll just wrap up finally in terms of what we need going forward. One of the things, I've talked about this a couple of times, that we need is just clerks need to have more time to count and canvass their ballots. We are now a state where the majority of people are likely going to be voting by mail in the future. I don't know what the percentage of people who will vote by mail in our city elections this year or our state elections in 2022 or our presidential election in 2024, but I think there's a very strong possibility we're going to continue to see 60, 70% of people choosing to vote by mail. There obviously are a lot of political issues now in terms of voting by mail, but even with that being said, in other states, when people start voting by mail, they generally like to continue to do it. And I think that's probably what's going to happen here. The current model where clerks have to wait until 7 a.m. on election day to start counting those ballots is really not sustainable if you want to have elections that are wrapped up in an orderly way on election night. Other states have figured this out. States like Ohio and Florida allow clerks to start counting ballots before election day. That's why they were able to have their election results done on Tuesday night, and we were not. So our clerks did a tremendous job getting through all of these ballots. But even with that, just because of the sheer volume, a lot of places didn't finish till Wednesday, some even till Thursday. And that allows a lot of misinformation to spread. It means you have tired election workers, and it just isn't an efficient way of conducting elections when you're sitting on thousands of ballots that have come in until election day. The other thing that we need is more time to actually canvass these ballots after election day. We have a pretty short 2-week post-election canvass period, and that's the time when the counties are supposed to be figuring out all these issues and errors that occurred on election day and reconcile the records. What we found when we did our post-election audits, especially in the absent voter counting boards, is that if the canvass had had more time to figure these things out, they actually would have figured out a lot of these things before we even looked at them. So we definitely need more than 2 weeks, especially in our larger communities, to actually get through those canvass processes. The second sort of big category of thing that I think we need for election administration in Michigan is we just need more resources for clerks. We were able to get by this year because we had a lot of federal funding. There was funding that came through from the CARES Act. There was also some funding that came through for election security. We were able to use that to support purchases of things like personal protective equipment that was needed to process more absentee ballots, high-speed voting machines, high-speed letter openers. But that was a one-time surge of resources that we got from the feds. We're not going to get that every election. A lot of jurisdictions also were able to get grants from private nonprofits that also supported them. But this isn't really the way we should be. We shouldn't be relying on grants and one-time infusions of money to fund our elections. There needs to be a more sustainable, consistent, predictable source of funding. One of the challenges that Proposal 2018-3 does cause is it does mean that election officials have to continue to provide all the resources and the staffing and the support in their polling places on election day, while at the same time supporting additional absentee voting and same-day registration at the clerk's offices. And they just need more resources to make that happen. The final thing I'll say is that I think we do need to look at some additional changes to election law that can help facilitate voter registration and absentee voting even further. Although we have a lot of great voter registration laws right now, there are some gaps there for some voters. A lot of the systems that I talked about, especially automatic voter registration and online voter registration, do depend on you having a Michigan driver's license or state ID. And there's a lot of voters in Michigan, especially student voters or people who've moved here recently, or low-income voters who may not have that or may not have a current driver's license. So there is a gap there. Obviously, things like voter registration drives, things like that the League of Women Voters does, that student groups do, that helps fill a gap. But I think we do need some additional flexibility to make voter registration easier for more voters. And then I think we also need to be looking at without some of the challenges they currently face. So whether that be more ballot drop-offs to register and to vote in advance of elections. There is a lot of legislation out there, obviously, that there's been a lot of attention on about 40 bills that were introduced in the Michigan State Legislature. They take various forms. A lot of the bills that have been introduced are not particularly helpful. They don't really respond to the things that election clerks have asked for, and they, in many ways would make voting more difficult unnecessarily. But there have been discussions, and there are bills out there as well that do have some components in them that could improve elections, like increasing the amount of time to count ballots, and some other common sense changes that I think a lot of the election clerks do support. So there is still an opportunity, despite the fact that we're in a highly charged political climate, for some pragmatic changes. So those are really what we need if we're going to have elections continue to work smoothly in Michigan. So I think that's all I have. I know it's about 8 o'clock. I want to make sure I leave room for questions. But big picture, I think that 2018-3, in addition to supporting the right to vote in general, was really just what we needed to make it through 2020, especially in terms of eliminating some of the voter registration problems we saw in past years, facilitating absentee voting, which we definitely needed, and also expanding post-election audits, which are a critical feature in terms of safeguarding election integrity. But we still have a long way to go in terms of getting to the optimal system and having something that's sustainable for elections going forward. And that's where we do need some comments and changes to the election law, and also continued more consistent, predictable resources for local election officials. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions, and I really appreciate the time again.
That's great. Thank you so much. We do have several questions that have come in advance, and I want to follow up on your comment about additional changes in election law, but I want to get to these questions first. And one is an interesting, well, they're all interesting, but this first one that came in was how have these constitutional changes affected small towns and rural areas? Have they had a disproportionate impact there as opposed to in urban environments?
Well, I think that it's an interesting question. I think that they have definitely affected larger and smaller communities in different ways. I think that some of the larger communities have seen challenges when it comes to having resources available to handle same-day registration, where you're going to see more of that in larger communities. Also staffing their polling places, then handle this huge volume of absentee ballots. That's really been something that the mid-size or larger cities have been especially challenged by, just the sheer volume of voters that they're trying to support in a lot of different ways. I think with the smaller communities, a lot of the challenges they face are just in terms of having just the basic resources that are needed on a day-to-day basis. I think that a lot of the components of Proposal 2018-3 do rest on the assumption that you're going to have kind of an office and staff and internet connection. A lot of places in Michigan, that's not really the case. I mean, we do, because we are so decentralized, in a lot of parts of the state, the township clerk is not necessarily full-time. It's not their full-time job. They're doing their election work in addition to other things they have to do for the township. They may not have a township hall to work out of. A lot of them work out of their homes. And so some of the requirements in Proposal 2018-3, like, I don't want to talk about this, but the working on the weekend, having weekend hours, which is part of the absentee voting changes, that did pose a problem for a lot of the smaller jurisdictions. So I do think that's another area where we need to think about making sure that, and this is again where resources come into play, but also thinking about, some of the basic kind of assumptions that you might make if you're used to living in a larger area about the resources that your local jurisdictions have. I think we do need to have some further consideration of, how these smaller communities with part-time clerks and not all the same resources are able to actually continue to support elections over this extended period of time.
Right, that's a big problem. So a really interesting question. So what percentage of these, I'm sorry, I have it, 1,520 local election officials, what percentage of those are in small towns and rural areas in Michigan?
That's an interesting question. It would sort of depend on how you define that. But I think about half of our jurisdictions are single precinct jurisdictions, which means that they have, fewer than a few thousand registered voters.
Right.
So, there's definitely a difference between a township that has 4,000 or 5,000 people versus ones that, that are even smaller than that. There's kind of a drop off. And there's also differences in terms of if you're a small township that's near a big city and you have good internet connection versus if you're in a small township, in a very rural area where you don't. But
Right.
It's a big chunk of our jurisdictions in Michigan that are very small.
That's interesting. Does it feel like maybe those challenges weren't taken into full account when the proposal was written?
Well, I mean, I have heard from some township clerks in more rural areas that do feel that way. I don't know. It's hard to write. We're a big state. We're very diverse. We have different types of jurisdictions. It's hard to have one set of rules that are perfectly going to work everywhere.
Right.
So, I mean, there's some components of our election law that I think are more difficult for more populous areas to implement, and there's some that are more difficult for less populous ones. But I do think some things like having weekend hours and having, making sure all the ballots are ready on the 40th day before the election and things like that. We did get reports from some of the smaller communities that is challenging. It's obviously something that's doable, but there needs to be the resources for it. Another example would be just the fact that the clerk has to make sure there's somebody at, the township hall or the clerk's office to take registrations on election day, but also make sure the polling places are being monitored. So if you're in a small community, you don't have a lot of staff, you don't necessarily have the resources that you need to staff both of those locations with experienced people at the same time.
Yeah.
So I think those are definitely areas where there does need to be more consideration for the resources that some of the smaller communities have.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's a whole new sort of a whole new framework for the idea of multitasking. like literally you have to be in more than one place at a time. Well, the next question is related in a way. It was, what are some of the obvious signs of free and fair elections that the average citizen like me can watch for?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think it's a really important component of our election system, which is generally the more people know about elections, the more involved in it they are, the better they feel about it. You very rarely see people who have worked as poll workers or election inspectors, or who have volunteered in their local clerk's office, or who are election officials. You very rarely see them making these kinds of outlandish claims, because they understand the checks that we have. So, if you work in a polling place, that there's bipartisan poll workers there, that there's a lot of checks that are done throughout the day to make sure that the equipment is working properly. That after the election, there's a bipartisan board of county canvassers that looks at everything. That there's checks with the county clerk and the secretary of state looking at things. You also know that election records are public records and are preserved. So I think one of the biggest signs that we have that our elections are free and fair is just that there is a very public, transparent process with records being preserved and available for the public to view whenever they want, and that's being sort of largely run by not just local clerks of both political parties, but actually everyday citizens that are working as poll workers of both political parties, or all political parties, or no political party, depending on what role they're playing in the election process. So I think that there's a lot of key elements there. And I think the most important thing to getting people to understand is to actually get them engaged in the election process, so they can actually see firsthand all of these checks and balances that we have in practice.
Yeah, I was thinking earlier about this, that the actual work of an election is pretty boring. Just when you're there on election day, it's generally quiet, and you're counting, and it's very sober. And, whereas the myths of voters, of all of these voting irregularities are very exciting. But the actual process of it is pretty routine and pretty boring. So, I agree with you. That's a good way for people to understand it, how it actually works. Another question that came in, is there any way to get around the petition law that lets this is in the Constitution, that lets the legislature subvert the will of the majority of Michigan voters by collecting signatures of a small minority of voters? So, of course, this person is thinking about the bolus of 39 election bills proposed in the Michigan Congress, and the expectation that the governor will veto ones that get passed that hurt voting rights. And then the suggestion that, the fact that the Constitution allows a petition drive of, I think it's a very small percentage of voters can sign a petition that then can enable the legislature to pass a law over that basically contravenes the governor's veto. So the question is, tell me if I got that right, but also what's the solution for that?
Well, I mean, those provisions are in our state constitution and our state election law. So, that's the process that we have in Michigan. If depending on how you feel about the particular initiatives that are being passed, you may have a different feeling about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I think that the only way to really, if you don't like that system, would be to change the state constitution or possibly change the election law, depending on which components of it you don't like. So, I mean, that's sort of the system we have. It's possible there may be litigation on this. The courts may weigh in, but those are the provisions that we have under the state law and state constitution.
Okay, so the most long-lasting solution is to change the Constitution.
Yeah, I mean, if you disagree with the current system we have, that would be the case. Yeah.
Okay. So you mentioned that voter registration had gone up significantly with the automatic registration, but I don't think I heard specifically what is our voter registration percentage?
Yeah, well, so we have about 8 million people registered to vote in Michigan. So, there's a lot of different ways to measure registration percentage. You also need to look at the number of those registrations that are active, because some of the registrations are inactive and, they will be canceled unless people vote or show that they're still eligible in Michigan. So it's always hard to get an exact number, but we have a very high registration rate. The metrics that we have generally show it, around 90%. And that's of eligible voters. So our registration rate already was pretty good pre proposal 2018-3, but some of the changes that we got, like automatic voter registration, really helped us bump it up. But voter registration percentage is a very difficult thing to measure, because you don't necessarily have an apples to apples set of data that you can look at. So depending on whether you look at it based on like census numbers, or whether you look at it based on active voters or all voters, or if you look at it based on survey results, you might get a different percentage. But that's generally about the range we're in.
About 90%. That's outstanding. So a question about the RLA, the audit, just a quick one. So you said that the matchup accuracy seems to be about within 1%. Sometimes elections are decided by less than that. So I just wonder about that. I mean, that seems really, really good. I mean, it is really, really good, but of course, sometimes elections are decided by 0.5.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, we're looking at a sample, right? So whenever you have a random sample, you're rarely going to get the exact, pinpoint to the 0.0% match up with the totals. Depending on how precise of a measure you want, you can keep counting more and more ballots. So if we wanted to, make sure we were within a decimal percentage point of the tabulated numbers, we could just count more ballots. But obviously there's a trade-off there in terms of the number of ballots that you count. And one of the benefits of the risk limiting audit is that you don't have to count all of the ballots.
Right.
So, this is still pretty new in Michigan. We haven't really figured out all the parameters of how to do it perfectly here. So we may do that in a future election. We may decide to count more ballots, a higher percentage of the ballots. It also depends on how, the way risk limiting audits work also depend on how wide the margin is, because you're really just trying to verify the outcome was correct. You're not necessarily trying to match the percentages exactly. So, in a future year where we have a closer election, we may count more ballots. But basically, just like with any kind of sampling, the way to get more precise is to count more ballots.
Okay. So if we were in an extraordinary situation, an extraordinarily close vote, we just count more ballots, maybe all of them.
Right. I mean, the way the risk limiting audit methodology works is if you want to get more and more precise, you could eventually just escalate to a full hand count of every ballot. If that's what you want to do, you can do that. In practice, if we had an extremely close statewide race in Michigan, someone would probably ask for a recount anyway.
Yeah.
So, if the race was, if we had a statewide race that was decided by a few hundred votes, you probably have a statewide recount anyway. So we'd be doing a full hand count anyway. The benefit of the risk limiting audit is that even if someone doesn't ask for a recount, we can still look at the paper ballots and get a strong amount of confidence that the outcome was correct.
Right. Got it. So, Jonathan, would you stop your screen share so we can have the whole screen? Well, here's a question I'm not sure I understand. How often did voters change their votes after submitting an absentee ballot? I know my neighbor
Right.
down the street did.
Right. So there is a process in Michigan where if you want, if you've returned an absent voter ballot, but it hasn't been counted yet, you can spoil the ballot and change your vote. So, you can't do it on election day because on election day, it's already been taken out of the envelope and it's already probably been counted, or if it hasn't, it's already been mixed in with other ballots, so no one can find your ballot anymore. But before election day, you can spoil it and ask for a new one. I actually don't, I'm sorry, I don't remember offhand the total number of people who spoil their ballots. That doesn't necessarily mean they change their vote, of course. Like someone may have spoiled their ballot because they wanted to go vote in person or some other reason. But I think it was in the tens of thousands this year. And I think it was slightly lower. Well, actually, I should say, as a percentage of people who voted absentee, it was lower than it was in 2016. But because we had so many more people vote absentee this year, it was probably higher overall.
An overall number. Yeah. Okay. And what about curing absentee ballots? What was the percentage of, I know it was pretty low, of the number of ballots that the clerks rejected for whatever reason? Mostly signatures, right? And then what's the opportunity to cure them?
Yeah, so that's also an interesting set of questions. I think so. There's sort of two reasons why an envelope might be rejected because of a signature issue. One is it's just missing a signature, which is actually more common. And two is because the signature was found not to match. One of the things that we did this year, leading into this year, was we redesigned the absent voter ballot envelopes to draw more attention to the signature line. Because what we found was working like with some nonprofit groups like the Center for Civic Design, was that some people were just not seeing, based on some user testing, so they were just like not seeing the signature line and realizing they needed to sign it. So by redesigning that envelope and making the signature line more prominent, the percentage of ballots that were rejected for a missing signature went way down. We did still have some, and we had some that were mismatched. But we did provide some guidance, and there was also some requirements and some changes to the election law that came in at the very last second about notifying voters if there was a missing or mismatched signature. Generally speaking, the clerks are extremely proactive about doing that if they can. I think most clerks, as soon as they see it that a signature is missing or mismatched, they will try to contact the voter right away. But it can create a problem for a couple different reasons. One, because you don't always have a phone number or an email address for a voter. In fact, although we're getting more of those now, historically, most voters, you don't have that. So you're basically relying on mailing them something.
Right.
And then number two, if the ballot comes in the last second, you're not necessarily going to be able to reach that voter in time for them to come in and cure it. So we did see, the rejection rate was fairly low overall. I don't know, I don't have a figure on curing, but I don't, overall, between the ballots that just, were not rejected and the ballots that were cured, it was a pretty low percentage of the ballots overall. The biggest reason the ballots get rejected typically is because they don't arrive on time. One of the signature issues.
Okay. Okay, let me see what else we've got here. I'm looking in the chat. Oh, yeah, Miriam asked about prepaid postage on ballots. Is that, where does that stand? Is that a clerk by clerk decision?
It is, and some jurisdictions do it. One thing that we did, because we had the federal money, was that we, at the state level, used that federal money to reimburse any clerks that wanted to provide prepaid postage on their ballots envelopes for 2020 for November. And a lot of clerks did that, but not everyone. But again, that's not something we can fund every year. We were able to do that because we had the federal funding, and that's again where the resources being more consistent is important. So now it's still left to the decision of the individual clerks whether, or really, the local government units, because they have to fund it, whether they do prepaid postage. There is legislation that one of the bills that was put out would ban prepaid postage. I don't understand the logic behind that. I would think, if anything, the opposite would be a better approach in terms of making sure people have postage prepaid. But currently, right now, it's up to the local jurisdictions to decide whether to do it. And if they do it, they have to fund it.
Because, in effect, it's effectively a poll tax to require voters to pay the postage. And I was talking, some of my friends have college age kids who don't know how to find a stamp. It's like, where would they go for a stamp? So that's another reason. And then, of course, you can get the postage wrong. So it would be great to have them all prepaid. And that's another reason to expand the number of drop boxes, obviously. Let me see what else we have here. I'm looking for all caps, just so you know. The hours are long for election workers, even the ballot counters. Is it possible to have shorter shifts? I would have volunteered for 4 or 5 hours, but not for 12.
Yeah, that's definitely a challenge. We did recommend that, especially in places that had absent voter counting boards, they did establish shifts so that you didn't have someone who was working for 2 days straight, which does happen, which is not good. But so Detroit and some of the other larger communities did tend to have shifts where they would have, one team that was working, a very long day, but one day, and then another team that would come over. I think part of the reason that there are some barriers to shifts, though. One is that you can't, once you've been in a polling place, there are rules against leaving until the polls close. So if you start, you can't really have a morning shift unless you're just going to stick around. So that's one of the issues that you have, especially in the absent voter counting boards, where you're not allowed to leave until 8 p.m. The other barrier is that, it is helpful to have people there for a longer period of time because of the continuity of knowledge and logic and operations. I would liken it, I don't know anything about the medical field, but I would liken it in some ways to like how medical shifts are long, because you want to have some continuity of care with patients.
Right.
It's probably a bad analogy. I'm sure there's some doctors on here who are rolling their eyes at me. But the idea is basically, if there's something going on or there's a practice being done at polling places, it is helpful to have people who are there for a longer period of time, so you don't have inconsistency between the way something's done in the morning and the way something's done in the afternoon. But that said, it is a problem because you have to, if you're working or something, you have to take the whole day off work. A lot of people just don't have the capacity for family. They might have family obligations, they might have medical limitations or other reasons why you can't work a 12-hour day or 16-hour day. So that is a barrier to poll workers, and I think it's something that we need to look at more closely. But we do have methods of avoiding these ridiculously long, like multi-day shifts. We have been able to allow people to at least go home at night, the same day they showed up.
Okay, and here's kind of a related question. This touches on something that we talked with Alex Halderman about last month about in terms of security, and he was talking about all of the ways in which voting machines are often insecure, and which scared the bejesus out of everybody, and how sometimes they're left in hallways and not secured in a nominal fashion. Cheryl says, of course we want ballots to be absentee ballots to be counted as they come in, if possible. We'd like to see a change in the law on that. What are the best practices for securing ballots that have been opened and counted before Election Day?
Yeah, I think, in terms of the security of election results, the paper ballot really is a key here, right? So we do have a lot of security measures to make sure that our voting equipment works properly and is not compromised. But the paper ballot is really the sort of the backstop. So even if there had been some ability to mess with voting machines, we still have those paper ballots, and we still count those paper ballots if we have to. And that's part of the reason that the risk limiting audit depends on counting the paper ballots. It's an independent check of the machines. That said, there are a lot of tests that are done before the election, after the election, to make sure that the machines are working properly. They are supposed to be securely stored. Something should not be left out in the hallway. If it is, that's not, they're not following the practice. It's supposed to be in a secure location. But the ballots themselves also have to be secured. So the current law has there's a requirement that when ballots are tabulated, they're then put in a secure, sealed ballot container. So it's a ballot container that is locked and that you cannot open without breaking a seal that has been recorded and documented. So you would know if anybody had, broken in and opened it and messed with it. So we would have to retain some version of securing the ballots after tabulation with any counting before election day, just as we do on election day. But, again, other states have figured this out. It's not rocket science. I'm sure we can do it.
Right. Okay. I think that's the last question in my queue. I'm going to give a minute or two for Rena Bash, who is the clerk of Ann Arbor Township. If you have any additional questions or comments.
Hello.
Hi.
Hang on. I got too many monitors going on here. I didn't have any other questions, but I did want to comment on some of the questions that came in. Somebody asked about how many ballots were spoiled. Obviously, as a local clerk, I don't have that big picture view, but I can tell you in the March 2020, because so many in the presidential primary, because so many Democratic candidates were dropping out, the largest number of voters I've ever experienced in my 16 years as a clerk were showing back up at the township office and wanted to spoil their ballots and retrieve them and get a new ballot to vote for a candidate that had not yet dropped out of the race. And so that's very challenging because you have to have a system for storing all those ballots that came in, and now you have to find a way to retrieve them from the drawers of thousands of ballots. Then you have to find that person's application. You have to spoil the ballot in the QVF and then reissue the ballot. So it's super challenging. And I want everybody to think about, though, that if you want to have that option, you can't then have those absentee ballots be counted ahead of election day. So while you might not like the system that we have right now, where those ballots sit in a drawer, locked up in a drawer until election day, and then all the absentee ballots get counted on election day, it does give you the opportunity to spoil your ballot. And if you change your mind or your candidate drops out. So if we started counting the ballots before election day, we would have to take away that right to spoil the ballot. So just something to think about that I wanted to mention. And also I wanted to agree with Jonathan about the curing or fixing or the rejecting of ballots. All the clerks I know, it really is, it's, people are always talking about that, like, we don't know what we're doing. We don't have training and verifying signatures. Well, it's pretty obvious when somebody signs somebody else's ballot, and usually it's we'll call it an honest mistake. They think they have power of attorney for their spouse. They'll even write on there, POA or something like that. And so it usually just means you have to call and explain the law and offer them the opportunity to come in and fix that, or get a new ballot, or the blank, the signature for the forgotten signature is also the most common situation that happens. And again, I would agree with Jonathan that the redesign of the envelopes seemed to improve that situation a little bit. So those are the only two things that I thought of to add. I guess from a logistical standpoint, I would also say that it would be supremely burdensome for smaller or mid-sized jurisdictions if you did try to change the law to allow counting absentee ballots or running them through a tabulator ahead of election day, just for all the security issues that were mentioned. How do you keep that locked up? How do you keep that secure? You basically have what I call an open tabulator sitting around for days on end. And the way the law is written right now, I need to have one person from each party monitoring a tabulator. So how are you going to do that in a smaller jurisdiction where you might not have the space, you don't have the staff? The clerk is working out of somebody's home. It's not like the precinct is going to be available for the 40 days ahead of the election. So personally, I don't think that tabulating ballots ahead of election day is going to be as easy as people think. So Those are the only comments I can think of.
That's great. Thank you. It's so good to have the perspective of one of the 1,520 people responsible for making our elections happen. Really helpful. Thanks, Rena.
Yeah.
And thank you, Jonathan. Do you have any last comments you would like to make?
Just that I'm glad Rena's here too, to provide perspective of local clerks who really understand how this works in many ways much better than we do at the state level. But I really appreciate everyone making time for us today. And thanks again. And I'm of course happy to answer any follow-up questions if people want to send them in.
All right, great. Thank you so much. We really appreciate your incredible work and your boss's incredible work too. We're so proud of Jocelyn Benson as our Secretary of State. She's just amazing. So thank you very, very much for being here. And thank you for all of your work.
Thanks
And thank
again.
all of and thank all the rest of you for joining us for Brews and Views. Thanks to our intrepid tech hosts, Nancy Brucken, Christine Buffington, and Susan Woolley. As I mentioned at the top, this was the second program in our series of 3 devoted to America's all-important voting systems. Next month on June 9th, we'll hear about the future of the Electoral College from expert Maria Woloshin. So look for details via email or on our website, lwvanarbor.org, or on our Facebook page at facebook.com/LWVAAA, as in Ann Arbor area. We look forward to seeing you on June 9th, and thanks for being here tonight. Take good care. Thanks again, Jonathan.